August 10th, 1970, the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, Tennessee. 18,500 people packed inside, waiting for the man who needed no introduction. The air was thick with anticipation, cigarette smoke, and the kind of energy that only happens when a legend walks on stage. Elvis Presley was at a crossroads that summer. The comeback special 2 years earlier had reminded the world why they fell in love with him in the first place. But now, standing on the edge of a new decade, he was fighting to prove he wasn't just nostalgia. He was fighting to prove he still mattered. The lights dimmed, the band struck the first chord, and Elvis walked out into that spotlight like he owned the universe. The crowd erupted, screams, tears, hands reaching toward the stage like he was salvation itself. For the next hour, Elvis gave them everything. The hip swivel that once scandalized America, the voice that could shatter hearts and mend them in the same breath, the charisma that made every person in that arena feel like he was singing directly to them. But then something happened that nobody expected. Midway through Suspicious Minds, Elvis stopped singing, just stopped. The band played on for a few confused seconds before trailing off into silence. 18,500 people held their breath. Elvis was staring into the crowd, not at the front rows where the VIPs sat, not at the screaming fans pressed against the stage. He was looking up, toward the back, toward the cheaper seats where the real fans sat, the ones who saved for months just to be there. And if you're watching this, you need to understand what made this moment so powerful. Because what happened next wasn't just about one night in Memphis. It was about who Elvis really was when the cameras weren't rolling and the mythology was stripped away. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the story I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about the King of Rock. And roll. Turn on notifications, give this video a thumbs up, and stay with me. Trust me, you'll want to hear every word of this. Elvis pointed toward the upper deck. Security immediately tensed. The band members exchanged glances. The audience craned their necks, trying to see what had caught his attention. There was a young woman standing in the aisle. Not sitting, standing. Security had been trying to get her to sit down for the past 20 minutes, but she refused. She was holding something, waving it frantically, tears streaming down her face. Most performers would have ignored her, would have signaled security to handle it, would have kept the show moving because time is money and the schedule is the schedule. Elvis didn't do that. He walked to the edge of the stage, microphone in hand, and said 5 words that silenced the entire Coliseum. "Bring her down here now." Security hesitated. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't safe. This wasn't how things were done. Elvis didn't care. He said it again, louder this time, with that edge in his voice that made it clear this wasn't a request. "I said, bring her down here." The crowd started cheering. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew they were witnessing something real, something unscripted, something that mattered. 2 security guards reluctantly escorted the young woman down the steps, through the crowd, toward the stage. She was maybe 20 years old, wearing a simple dress that had clearly been chosen with care. Her hands were shaking. The thing she'd been waving was a photograph. Elvis knelt down at the edge of the stage as she approached. 18,500 people watched in absolute silence as this girl, this stranger, this fan who had broken the rules, handed Elvis that photograph. He took it gently, studied it, and then something happened that nobody in that arena will ever forget. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the man who had everything, started to cry. Not a single tear rolling down his cheek, not a moment of moistness in his eyes. Real, visible, undeniable crying. His shoulders shook. His hand went to his face. The photograph trembled in his grip. The band members stood frozen. The backup singers didn't know where to look. The audience was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop in the nosebleed section. And here's where this story becomes something more than just a concert moment. Here's where you understand why this night mattered so much, that people still talk about it 54 years later. That photograph was of a soldier, army uniform, young face, bright smile, the kind of kid who believed in something bigger than himself. The young woman's voice, barely audible even through the silence, reached the microphones. "That's my brother. He died in Vietnam 3 months ago. He loved you. He played your records every single day. I promised him if I ever got to see you, I'd show you his picture. I promised him." Elvis didn't let go of that photograph. He stood up slowly, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and did something that protocol, security, insurance, and common sense all said he shouldn't do. He invited her onto the stage. The security team moved to stop it, but one look from Elvis froze them in place. He reached down, took her hand, and helped her up. She stood there, on that stage in front of 18,500 people, shaking like a leaf. Elvis put his arm around her shoulders. He held up the photograph so the audience could see it, though most were too far away to make out the details. And then he spoke. "This young man right here," Elvis said, his voice cracking, "this soldier, he gave everything for his country. He's not here tonight, but his sister is, and she kept a promise to him. That takes courage, that takes love, that takes the kind of strength that most of us will never understand." The audience was crying now, not just a few people, hundreds, maybe thousands, grown men, with tears streaming down their faces, women sobbing openly, teenagers who came to scream for their idol, now silent and shattered. Elvis turned to the young woman. "What was his name?" "Michael," she whispered. "His name was Michael." "Michael," Elvis repeated, speaking to the entire Colosseum now. "We're going to do something for Michael tonight. We're going to make sure he's remembered. We're going to make sure his sacrifice meant something. And right here, right now, I need you to understand why you should be part of this channel, because this is what we do. We find the stories that matter, the moments that reveal who people really were beneath the mythology, the truth that gets buried under decades of legend and rumor. Subscribe to the Hidden Legacy. Hit that like button. Because stories like this, stories that show the real human beings behind the icons, that's what we're here for. Elvis asked the band to bring him a stool. He sat down, that photograph still in his hand, and he started talking, not to the audience, to Michael, to a dead soldier he'd never met, to a kid who'd played his records in some barracks halfway around the world before dying in a jungle that most Americans couldn't find on a map. He talked about his own time in the army, about being far from home, scared, missing his mother, about the soldiers he'd met who never made it home, about the guilt he felt for being safe, famous, untouchable, while kids like Michael were being shipped home in boxes. "I got to come home," Elvis said. "I got to have this life, this career, these people here tonight. Michael didn't. And I want his sister and all of you to know that I don't take that for granted, not for 1 second." The silence in that arena was profound. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This wasn't a concert. This was something else entirely, something raw and real and painful. Elvis handed the photograph back to the young woman. "You keep this safe," he said, "and you tell everyone about Michael. You make sure people know who he was. You make sure he's not forgotten." She nodded, unable to speak, tears flowing freely. "Can you do me a favor?" Elvis asked her. She nodded again. "Stay right here for the next song. Right here on stage with me, because I'm going to sing this for Michael, and I want you to know he's hearing it." The band knew what was coming before Elvis said a word. They'd seen that look before, that determination, that need to make something matter. Elvis stood up, the young woman still beside him, and he started singing an American trilogy, the song that combined Dixie, the battle hymn of the Republic, and All My Trials, into something that transcended any single war, any single era, any single loss. His voice filled that Colosseum like thunder and honey mixed together. Every note carried the weight of what had just happened. Every word was for Michael, for all the Michaels, for every kid who'd ever died believing in something bigger than themselves. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. By the time he hit the final note, there wasn't a dry eye in the building. The young woman was sobbing. Elvis was crying. The band was crying. The audience was destroyed. When the song ended, the silence lasted for 5 full seconds, 5 seconds that felt like an eternity. And then the applause started. Not the screaming, frantic teenage hysteria of a rock concert. Something deeper, something more profound. A standing ovation that came from the soul. Elvis hugged the young woman, a real hug, the kind you give family. He whispered something in her ear that nobody else heard. She nodded, wiped her tears, and security helped her back to her seat. But this time, they weren't rough. They weren't annoyed. They escorted her like she was royalty. Elvis stood there for a moment, collecting himself. The photograph was gone, but its presence lingered in that arena like smoke. And then, because he was Elvis Presley, and he knew how to hold a room, he smiled that crooked smile and said, "Well, I bet you weren't expecting that tonight." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. The tension broke just enough for people to breathe again. "Let's keep going," Elvis said. "For Michael." And he did. He performed for another 45 minutes. Every song had a little more weight to it now. Every movement seemed more deliberate. He wasn't just entertaining anymore, he was testifying. But here's what most people don't know about that night. Here's the part that didn't make it into the reviews, or the bootleg recordings, or the official histories. After the concert, Elvis didn't go straight to his dressing room. He asked someone to find that young woman, to bring her backstage. And when she arrived, still shaking, still processing what had happened, Elvis sat with her for over an hour. They talked about Michael, about his childhood, his dreams, his last letter home. Elvis listened to every word like it was scripture. He asked questions. He looked at more photographs. He made sure she knew that Michael mattered to him, that this wasn't just a show business moment, that he genuinely cared. Before she left, Elvis did something that he'd only done a handful of times in his entire career. He gave her his personal phone number, not his manager's number, not his publicist's number, his actual, real phone number. "If you ever need anything," he told her, "you call me. I mean it. Anything." She never called. Years. Later, in an interview, she said she couldn't bring herself to do it, that what Elvis had given her that night was already more than she could have ever hoped for, that he'd honored Michael's memory in front of 18,500 people, that he'd made her brother matter. But here's the thing, that phone number worked. Other people who knew her confirmed it. Elvis had given her a direct line to him, and he meant it. And if you think this channel is about more than just gossip and rumors, if you believe in finding the real stories behind the legends, then subscribe to The Hidden Legacy right now. Hit that notification bell. Give this video a thumbs up, because we're going deeper than anyone else is willing to go. We're finding the truth. The reviews of that concert barely mentioned what happened. A paragraph here, a sentence there. Emotional moment with audience member. Elvis honors fallen soldier. Brief, dismissive, moving on to talk about his vocal performance and his outfit. But the people who were there never forgot. For decades afterward, they'd tell the story. At dinner parties, in online forums, in handwritten letters to Elvis fan clubs. They'd describe that moment when the king of rock and roll stopped being a legend and became a human being. There's a bootleg recording of that concert floating around collector circles. Poor quality, taped on someone's primitive cassette recorder from the upper deck. You can barely hear Elvis's words when he's talking to the young woman. But you can hear the silence, you can hear the weight of what's happening, and if you listen carefully, you can hear the moment when 18,500 people remembered that music isn't just entertainment, it's connection, it's empathy, it's love. Elvis died 7 years later, August 16th, 1977. The world mourned the king, but the people who were in Memphis that night in 1970, they mourned the man who stopped a concert for a grieving sister, the man who cried for a soldier he never met, the man who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is acknowledge someone's pain. That young woman, whose name was Sarah Mitchell, lived a long life. She married, had children, became a grandmother. She kept that photograph of Michael in a frame in her living room until the day she died in 2019. And next to it, she kept a photograph from that night in Memphis. Someone in the audience had captured the moment Elvis was holding her brother's picture, and they'd tracked her down to give it to her. 2 photographs, 2 brothers in a way, one who died in a jungle, one who died too young in a mansion, both loved by a sister who kept her promises. In the years after that concert, Elvis did dozens more shows, hundreds probably. He had his struggles, his demons, his decline. The later years weren't kind to him, but people who worked with him, who knew him, they all said the same thing. He never forgot moments like that night in Memphis. He carried them with him. They weighed on him. He understood that his fame, his talent, his position, they gave him a responsibility to acknowledge the pain of the people who loved him. There's a letter that Sarah Mitchell wrote to Elvis a month after that concert. She never sent it, but her daughter found it after Sarah died and shared it with a fan publication. In it, she thanks him not just for what he did on stage, but for seeing her brother as a person, for not treating Michael like a statistic or a prop, for understanding that behind every uniform, every flag-draped coffin, every name on a memorial wall, there's a life that mattered. You didn't have to stop the show, she wrote. You didn't have to cry. You didn't have to care. But you did. And that night, in front of all those people, my brother was alive again. He was real. He was remembered. Thank you for giving me that gift. And here's the final thing you need to understand about that night. Here's why this story matters 54 years later, long after both Elvis and Sarah are gone. We live in a world that moves fast, that forgets quickly, that treats people like content, like statistics, like background noise. We scroll past tragedies. We consume pain like entertainment. We forget that behind every headline, every viral moment, every trending topic, there are real human beings with real stories. That night in Memphis, Elvis Presley reminded 18,500 people that we don't have to live that way, that we can stop, that we can see each other, that we can honor the people who deserve to be honored. He didn't have to do it. It cost him nothing to keep singing, to ignore that young woman in the upper deck, to maintain the professional distance that celebrities are supposed to keep. But he chose differently. He chose connection over convenience. He chose humanity over performance. And in doing so, he created a moment that transcended music, transcended fame, transcended everything except the simple, powerful act of acknowledging that someone's pain matters. If you've made it this far, if this story has moved you the way it moved those 18,500 people in 1970, then do me a favor. Subscribe to The Hidden Legacy. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because this is what we do here. We find the stories that remind us what it means to be human. We dig beneath the mythology to find the truth. We honor the moments that deserve to be remembered. And maybe, just maybe, we can carry forward what Elvis started that night in Memphis. We can stop scrolling. We can see each other. We can remember that behind every story, there's a person who matters. Michael Mitchell died in Vietnam in 1970. Sarah Mitchell kept her promise to him. Elvis Presley honored them both. And now, 54 years later, you know their names. You know their story. That's what legacy really means. Not the records sold or the movies made or the headlines generated. Legacy is the moment when someone stops everything to acknowledge your pain. Legacy is keeping a promise to someone who can't be there to see it fulfilled. Legacy is the ripple effect of compassion moving through time. Elvis had his demons. He had his failures. He wasn't a saint, and he'd be the first to tell you that. But on August 10th, 1970, in Memphis, Tennessee, he was exactly what the world needed him to be. He was real. He was present. He was human. And 18,500 people, including one grieving sister, were forever changed because of it.